evening. I want to call this meeting to order of the Geneva Historic Preservation Commission for Tuesday, June 20th, 2023. The first item on our agenda is a roll call.
Stazen,
Here.
Solomon,
Here.
Phillips,
Here.
McManus,
Here.
Jensen,
Here.
Hartman,
Here.
Zelmer.
Here.
We have quorum.
Great, thank you very much, Michael. The next item on our agenda is approval of meeting minutes. Anybody have any comments about the March 14th, 2023 meeting minutes? If not, can I get a motion to approve the meeting minutes as presented?
I move to approve the minutes of March 14th, 2023.
I'll second.
Okay. Can you call the roll?
Yes. Hartman.
Aye.
Jensen,
Aye.
McManus,
Aye.
Phillips,
Abstain.
Salmon,
Aye.
Stazen,
Aye.
Zelmer.
Aye. Okay, and the next one is May 30th, 2023 meeting minutes. Any revisions to that set of meeting minutes? If not, can I get an motion to approve the meeting minutes?
I so move.
And a second?
I second.
Great. And if you could call the roll.
Hartman,
Aye.
Jensen,
Aye.
McManus,
Aye.
Phillips,
Aye.
Salmon,
Aye.
Stazen,
Aye.
Zelmer.
Aye. Motion passes. Okay. The next on our item on our agenda is the continuation of the public hearing for 4 East State Street, case number 2022-079 and 2022-080. Tonight, we resume the public hearing for the proposed demolition and de-designation of 4 East State Street. The purpose of this evening's public hearing is to receive the response from our consultant team, Tuscan Associates, and the Planera Group, which will be entered in the public record. Upon hearing the response, the commissioners may ask questions of the consultant. However, because the applicant's representative, Mr. David Patzel, is unable to attend this evening's meeting, we will not receive any other testimony tonight. Can I get a motion to open the continued public hearing at this time?
Motion to open the meeting.
And a second?
I second.
Okay, and if you could call the roll one more time.
Hartman,
Here.
Jensen,
Here.
McManus,
Aye.
Phillips,
Aye.
Salmon,
Here.
Stazen,
Here.
Zelmer.
Aye. Okay. The meeting is open. I will call Mr. Scott Goldstein of Tuscan Associates to the lectern, please.
Thank you. So my name is Scott Goldstein. I'm a principal of Tuscan Associates. The report and the updated findings are by Tuscan Associates and Planera Group. Terry Haymaker, joint author, was unable to make it tonight because she's,
Sorry, I couldn't hear you.
I'll start again. Is that better? My name is Scott Goldstein, the principal of Tuscan Associates. I'm representing both Tuscan Associates and the Planera Group, a joint author of the report. Terry Haymaker was unable to attend tonight because she is out of town. Pleased to come, please get this. There we go. So we're pleased to come back tonight to submit a revised report based on comments from the applicant that will address the presentation. Will follow in order of the report that you just received. Just to remind you that we were retained by the City of Geneva to analyze the pro forma submitted by the applicant, by the application for demolition of a designated property at 4 East State Street. Tuscan Associates and Planera Group analyzed the applicant's pro forma, interviewed the applicant and 14 developers, real estate, historic preservation practitioners, consulted industry standards. The ordinance that we've reviewed at prior meetings, 10-6-10, among the language states that demolition shall be considered only when all other redevelopment options for a building, structure, object, improvement, or site have been exhausted. Tesco and Panera considered possible alternatives, including renovating the building as either a standalone project or in concert with the full site. Tesco and Panera have updated the analysis to address comments from the applicant that we're going to review tonight. First, we presented this slide last time, but there's one new addition. In addition to pro forma, which is what we were analyzing, net operating income, which is the income from rent less any operating expenses, the applicant used one measure. There's many measures that real estate investors use to determine value and whether to invest in a project. The applicant used return on investment, which is the ratio of cash flow the project makes to the amount of equity invested at the onset, and we also use that methodology. But in addition, we consulted other investors, other real estate professionals, and there was consensus to also look at internal rate of return, which is the rate of growth of real estate investment that includes cash flow, as well as the net present value of the increased value of the property over a given period of time. In this case, we use 10 years. So the difference between ROI and IRR is IRR includes the expected increased value of the property. Geneva has had historic property growth. It's not to say ROI is also legitimate. These are different ways of looking at value, so we're going to present both ways. Last time, Terry Haymaker talked about pro rata cost sharing. I'm not going to go into that tonight. We used the same assumptions as last time. I am going to talk just a little bit about funding sources because that came up at the hearing I testified at, as well as the hearing that Mr. Petzold spoke at. First, just to clarify that we looked at scenarios both with public incentives and without, so we did not assume any public funds would necessarily be required. What we did was, our assignment was to look at alternatives, both with public subsidies and without. The ones that we've discussed are tax increment financing. This site is within an existing TIF district in Geneva, as you know, and it's a commonly used tool to support community redevelopment projects. Through the use of TIF, municipalities capture future property tax revenue increases from a defined area or district to use towards an economic development project or public improvement. The possible TIF subsidy for a project like this would be based on the amount of expected growth in property tax revenue as a result of the new development. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on TIF, but just want to make sure everyone understands it's in a TIF district. That's why in some of the scenarios we included TIF. Federal historic tax credits, there was discussion about whether this would be eligible or not. We're not issuing any opinion. We do think that there has not been a formal determination or a formal application. Again, we look at scenarios both with federal historic tax credits and without. For those that would include it, the income tax credit is equal to 20% of the qualifying rehabilitation expenditures. So typically, developers will layer in different sources of financing. It's not a huge amount of money, but it would be typical for a project like this to apply for that. The one that we did not estimate that we talked about last time, but I think is important, is a preservation easement. And that essentially the owner of the property would donate the undevelopable portion of the development to a qualified nonprofit. It would be able to take a tax reduction as a result of that donation. So it's sort of like donating open space, but you're donating the development potential of the site. We're not experts in appraisal, so we did not determine the cost, but that is an additional possible source of funds for these types of projects. Okay, so we organized this into 8 major comments that the applicant had, and I'll walk you through them. The first was the applicant questioned whether it was legitimate to look at the full site as opposed to only the standalone site. Our alternatives analysis considers both standalone scenarios as well as development of the full parcel. The historic structure sits on a single zoning parcel with a single parcel identifier number, commonly called a PIN. The area under the historic structure has not been subdivided from the larger site, and in addition, the corner site was also considered because it was part of the 2019 charrette process that the applicant and the city were participants in, and the applicant confirmed at the May 2nd public hearing that they have site control of the property. Again, we're not making a determination on that. Our job is to look at all alternatives. This this building sits on one pin of a larger site, plus the applicant could pool this together, if they so chose, with the corner site that they have site control. That's why we looked at various alternatives. The commissioners last time asked whether we had looked at all alternative uses of the property. And we looked at a number of them: office, retail, restaurant, cafe, indoor-outdoor event space, as an amenity for a larger residential project. In general, what we found is that the applicant had used a market rate rent of $20 a square foot. So really, the increased value would be attaching it to a larger project, and that's why we looked at the full site redevelopment. There could be additional revenue from rental of the structure or the open space. There's a number of event spaces in downtown Geneva right across the river. That might be some additional revenue. We did not quantify that. We used the scenarios that were developed in the shred because it's a public record. There could be other possible uses of the site, although we generally think primarily a multifamily residential would be the highest value of the property, and that's why we considered it. There could be some commercial as a part of this. We don't think that 100% commercial site would necessarily bring as much value as a residential, and that's why we looked at that scenario. The second comment from the applicant was questioning the land cost of the historic site, and I really wanted to clarify, we did not find that there was any real or perceived taking of the property. In fact, historic designation of the property is an example of many regulations, similar to zoning, that provides parameters regarding the use of the property based on existing ordinances. The market value that we use of the $50,000 is based on the projected market value based on the assessor's assessment of nearby vacant land using the same comparable properties that the applicant had used in their demolition application. That was only so that's the way the assessor does it. It's 1/3 of market value. So we took those assessed values of land, multiplied it by 3, and that's $51,000 to be exact. We rounded down to $50,000. So we were not presuming any type of taking at all. There were some comments on a few different aspects. The first, leasing fees. This is a minor element in the pro forma. We question whether those would be necessary if the owner occupied the space. It doesn't really make a material difference. This is a very small amount of money. Federal historic tax credits, we considered options both with tax credits and without credits. We're not making an opinion whether or not this qualifies for them. Again, about a $200,000 amount, not a huge difference in this, so that could be a slightly larger TIF investment from $1.5 million to $1.7 million, as the applicant had suggested. And I already covered, we also used ROI calculations, which is a snapshot in time, but we've added looking at internal rate of return, which factors in the projected increase. So it's the net present value, the current value of a future gain in property over 10 years, plus the net cash flow, the net present value of the net cash flow. So it's another measure of whether, if you're going to buy a building, presumably in a place like Geneva, you're expecting the value of that property to increase over time, not just the annual earnings, or in this case, rent of the building. And that's why we look at both, and we'll show both results. The analysis of the standalone scenarios, what we called 1A and 1B, this is really looking at the pro forma that the applicant had submitted. And we have no changes. There wasn't questioning of the applicant on the major assumptions of the standalone. And so essentially, we've kept our projection of essentially a break-even ROI of 1.3% annually without subsidies. I should note that the applicant did include a 10% developer fee, a one-time fee, which is on the high side, but you would expect a developer to take a fee out of development, so we didn't question that. Scenario B is the standalone with public participation of between $1.5 and $1.7 million, which would be a small portion of the projected increase in increment of the total site of about 3.5% to 4%, much lower than what Geneva typically has invested. That would return a 10% ROI plus a one-time 10% developer's fee. That's a typical return on investment for a public-private partnership. We explained last time it's typically a little lower because there's less risk because the public is investing in the project. So that gets to, so we have not changed any of these projections, but just wanted to clarify that a standalone without subsidies would essentially be break even. So as part of a larger project, it doesn't really influence very much the overall return of the larger project because this piece is essentially break even. If you did a standalone on its own, it would require public incentives to reach a market rate return of 10%. Okay, so none of that has changed. So when we look at the other scenarios, the applicant correctly pointed out there was a math error. We are using monthly payments rather than annual, so we have corrected those. We have updated market assumptions for rent and operating expenses at the time of the application. The applicant pointed out of using a stress test. There's 3 different types of loan. The banks tend to use the least risky loan, in this case, a debt service covered ratio, a DSCR. So we use that loan. So the ROI did decrease. We were much higher before, down to about 3.5%. But when we look at internal rate of return, you're at more of the 11 to 12%. Typically, developers, that would kind of be the bare minimum they would be looking for. They'd probably want a little bit higher IRR, but it does show you the difference in ROI, which is a one-time annual kind of look at it versus the increase of value, which would be higher. So what the general finding is this, is that the difference with doing the historic building on the full site versus without, our conclusion has not changed. This piece just doesn't fundamentally change the numbers very much because the math error that we had was taken all the way through. So it's apples and apples through it. So there's a lower return, but you're not seeing a substantial difference. Yes, there is a difference, but it's not swinging whether the larger site is financeable or not. Okay? The last point is extremely important to point out. We did not assume any public investment in either of these scenarios. So this would be pure market rate project, minimum returns. For an investor who would want to see higher returns, the best way to do that would be some type of public-private partnership. And then those returns would be higher. So again, what we're trying to do is compare apples and apples. So in these scenarios, we're not looking at any public participation at all to show you what the minimum returns would be. If there was TIF, if there was a preservation easement, if there were historic tax credits, all those numbers would be higher. Okay? If you remember last time, we also looked at a scenario with a partial 5th floor, essentially penthouses that bring more value to the property, with similar conclusions. We updated the annual debt service, we used lower risk DSCR loans, and we did not find a substantial difference in the returns with doing the historic building versus without. They're lower, about a 0.5% difference, so they're not negligible. But generally, you've got to get in the range of whether to invest in the project or not. This is a small part of a $40 to $45 million project, and so essentially it would be the investment in this property as a part of a larger project doesn't substantially change the returns in a large way. Again, this excludes any benefits from public investment. So again, if there were TIF, if there was a preservation easement, any of those typical tools that are used, those returns would be higher. We didn't want to project what the city might invest. We simply said that that would be on top of what the returns would be. So the summary of key findings. The standalone reuse of the historic building without any public investment would essentially a break-even scenario of about 1.3% ROI. A public-private partnership that provides approximately $1.7 million, and it could be through TIF, it could be through historic tax credits, et cetera. That equals 3.5% of total development costs. So typically a city is looking at 25% or more eligible TIF expenditures. This would be far below that. And that would return a 10% ROI in line with typical returns for a public-private partnership. When you look at the other scenarios, an as-of-right 4-story development on the full site would yield similar ROI and IRR. I apologize for all the letters, but that's the way the industry is. And that would be similar with or without the renovation of the historic building. A similar conclusion for the larger project with the partial fifth floor. There would not be substantial differences in the returns with or without renovating the historic building. So our conclusion is that the reuse of the historic building as a standalone project is viable alternative as part of a public-private partnership. The ROI and internal rate of return for larger projects is similar, and that would depend on essentially the viability of the larger site. And that may or may not require public subsidies depending on what the property owner would want to pursue. And I'll be available to answer questions from the commissioners.
You can, yeah. You turn on your mic, though.
In the alternative that's 2A and 2B, previously, Shodin basically was saying that there were negative returns on those two alternatives, particularly using an annual payment fee for the loan versus the monthly. So now you're showing that even using the annual payment, that there's a 3.41.
I believe the applicant had estimated about 1.5%, so we're a little bit higher than where he was.
So he wasn't actually negative.
I don't think it was negative. I'd have to check my notes, but I think he was
Okay.
showing, we were substantially higher, he was much lower at about 1.5%.
Right. And so yours now says ROI at stabilization. What does that at stabilization?
Oh, good question. So that means the moment in time is after the project is completed and leased up. So we did the same thing as the applicant. You don't do it year one because you might not be in this, with residential, it's going to take 2 or 3 years. I think this was year 3 or year 4 would be the time to do it. So we'd agree with the way the applicant did that.
Okay. And in the previous scenarios, there was like a $200,000 used in TIF money for, I'm not sure what that was for, whether it was for, just the landmark piece of
Yeah, that was
the property, which in my mind is not correct or would not.
So the
even-
$200,000, I believe, was for the estimated federal historic tax credit. So we have.
Well, that was 190.
Okay.
And
so
then there was
essentially-
another 200
Okay.
on top of that.
So the TIF estimate was based on the increment of that small piece of property. So that was the 200,000. To really get to market returns of 10%, you're talking more like $1.5 to $1.7 million.
Thank you.
And any other questions? George?
No, not at this time.
Lisa?
Not this time.
Not at this time. Jewel?
Not really at this time. I just want to confirm that, I was trying to take notes as you were speaking. Your conclusion is that it has not really changed, that there still is going to be an ROI and an IRR that is going to show that either with the historical building or removing the historical building, there will be a return.
Let me clarify. So what we did lower the projected ROI in the scenarios because it's annual, not monthly payments. So we found that essentially that for a standalone site, stayed the same, a 10% return if there's a public investment, break even without. For the larger projects, we are looking at a positive return. Typically, a developer would be looking for higher value than 3.5%. And to get to a higher value would probably mean some type of public investment, which the applicant at the last meeting was essentially laying out an argument for why TIF or other things would be necessary. We're not making that argument. We're just correcting the numbers to show what our projected return would be.
Okay.
Okay?
Thank you.
Yeah.
The only question I have, I mean, you said that you could be done without a TIF, but you don't, are you agnostic when it comes to whether it would be done without a TIF? I mean, would it be, I mean, a
Right,
develop,
we would think that an applicant would be looking for higher returns than 3.5%. Now, again, you're at 11% IRR or 12% without any TIF. That would be kind of the bare minimum that most developers would be looking for. They'd probably be looking for a little bit more than that. Again, we didn't include any of those, just to be clear on the numbers. It is in a TIF district. There's precedent for the city investing in these types of projects. Basically, all of the cost of renovating that building would be eligible TIF expenses because it's infrastructure, it's renovation versus a new building. So the new building, you could only use TIF for the acquisition, for example, the acquisition of the corner site would be an eligible expense. The infrastructure for the new building would be an eligible expense. The new building itself would not, but the landmark building would be.
okay.
Okay?
And that's meeting, is that specific to Geneva's TIF?
No, that's
in
state
this-
law.
What's that? It's state law?
That's state law.
Okay.
Question on that, though, but then we're talking about allocation of funds. So it's a choice, do I put it in the historic building, or do I allocate those TIF funds for some other part of the project?
Well, that would be up to the applicant, to
Right.
the TIF, to
Right.
make a proposal.
And you
So
were,
in either case, the money that would go back to the developer is generated by the larger site. So, you know, that's not what we're talking about tonight, is that would be the city council to decide how the TIF would be allocated.
but that would be based on a proposal by the developer,
Correct.
correct?
Correct.
And there was a number in there of a certain amount of TIP money is it available? I guess that's the,
We project the increment to be about $5.4 million.
okay.
So the way the TIF works is the increased value of the property is the increment over the base year. That essentially would be up to the city to say a portion of that could be used as an incentive for that project to happen. The state test is but for the TIF. So the
Yeah.
whole premise of TIF is that the project couldn't happen but for the TIF investment.
So that 5 million is what the entire property, the increment on the entire property is expected to gain? Or to
Correct, so
have
that would be available, that's the net present value of the increment, without
Okay.
getting too technical here, that could then be reallocated back to the
So the
developer.
1.7 million is
Well, so 1.7 million is a portion of the total, of the total development cost, is typically how a municipality will look at that. So typically, they're gonna look and say, okay, this is gonna increase this amount of investment in the project, we will make an incentive back of 20%, 25%, 30%. In this case, this would be a much lower
you're
allocation.
only using 3.5%
Right.
or whatever, so.
Now, they may ask for more, because the case the applicant made at the last meeting was that for the larger project to work, he'd be wanting to have higher returns.
Right.
We're not commenting on that, we're simply just
Right.
presenting, our only assignment was to look at the alternatives of the use of the historic property, not to test the viability of the full site as a whole. And we're finding is this is not the substantial change, because that project is $40 to $42 million, and this is about $2 million.
And this is based on taking that historic property and basically, as a standalone, putting everything into it, like,
So this is the full, we did not question the expert
Right.
analysis of, and several of you thought it was high. We assumed the high value, the full value of that.
but the
Altus-
cost of that
Altus-
building
yes,
was like $2 million or
Right.
something like that.
For a very small footprint, yes.
If they decided not to build that building as a standalone office building, then, and basically did something else with it, like incorporated or integrated it with something, a part of a larger development, then the ROI would probably even go up because they wouldn't be spending as much on that building itself. Because maybe they wouldn't need to put, toilets in there or an MEP system.
Right,
or-
that was expert cost analysis by Altus Works. We did not
Right.
question that. I think we agree it's at the high end. We kept those full values in there. There was double counting before, and we accounted for that.
Right.
The original pro forma showed additional expenses that were already included in the Altus report. That's why our cost estimate was a little lower than the applicant's, because there was some double counting of the numbers. Okay.
Any other questions from the commission? Okay. Well, then, with that, we've heard the testimony of the Tesca and Planera Group, and I would look for a motion to continue the public hearing to the next regularly scheduled meeting of the HPC, which is July 18th, 2023. At that time, we would expect the testimony to be concluded from the public, and the applicant will be provided a closing statement time. Can I get a motion to continue the public hearing to a date certain?
Hi. I move to continue the public hearing to Tuesday, July 18th.
And
I
can I get-
motion, I second.
Okay. Any?
Excuse me, Chairman Zellmer, I am unavailable on July 18th. I don't know if we are requesting a full quorum.
Well, we would want to get a quorum at least.
Okay,
I'll be there.
I'm there.
I believe I'm here. George, are you available?
I'm uncertain at this point in time.
We would still have a quorum at
Okay.
that time.
okay.
With two missing, we'd actually have an extra,
Okay.
so we'd be good. It's not ideal, but it'll work. Okay. With that, can you call the roll?
Hartman,
Aye.
Jensen,
Aye.
McManus,
Aye.
Phillips,
Aye.
Salmon,
Aye.
Stazen,
Aye.
Zelman.
Aye. Motion carries. Okay. The next item on our agenda is the secretary's report.
I have nothing for the commission this evening.
Okay. Do we have any new business from the commission?
No 5-minute field guide?
No, I did not present a 5-minute field guide. I am trying to keep those limited for the sake of brevity for these public hearing meetings.
Understood.
Very good.
Disappointed.
Yes. Any new business from the public? If not, I could get a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
Great. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Any opposed? We're adjourned.